You so much, everyone, and thank you especially to the Institute for organizing this conference, and especially to Ing Chao and all our friends in Italy and all over the world, especially in China. I would like to be there, and I hope to do it as soon as possible. I clearly had to be really fast with my speech, so let me introduce my speech entitled Military Culture of Brescia in the Venetian Era. We are talking about this really important town in the Venetian mainland, Brescia, who became part of the Republic of Venice in 1426, sorry, to bolster its reign of the mainland. Venice equipped itself with knights, and they took great benefits from that. Here you can see the Republic of Venice in early modern era. It was in fact with the knights who earned the most significant margins in terms of political maneuvering in the cities that joined the Republic, while jurists were entrusted with defining the subjection agreements they would enter into with ruling party. This is how, during the early years of the Venetian rule in Lombardy, this is the tale of the Brescian territory between 15th and 18th century. That a political system was created to base the mediation of the city's ruling classes for the management of the government at local level. In green, there is the Brescian territory, in red, the Bergamasque, and in the yellow part, the last part of the Venetian Lombardy, that is Crema. Meanwhile, feudal landowning knights in the countryside were tasked with securing the borders, which could be controlled via a system of forts that were concentrated particularly along the Oglio River on the southern part of the territory. As in all of the Republic's largest cities, Venice began to send to Brescia, really every 2 years, 2 magistrates acting as representatives of its sovereignty. Towards the end of the 15th century, Brescia essentially became one of Europe's 20 most populous cities and one of its largest manufacturing centers. Demographic and economic development in the Brescia area kept step with its most important commercial manufacturing area, metallurgy and weapons. In the Venetian era, the ironworking facilities were mainly concentrated in the valleys to the north of the town, particularly in Valtrompia. Small forges, trip hammers, and premises used for finishing weapons were instead located in Chiusure, the suburb of the city, located just outside the walls. Here you can see an overview of Brescia and its castle. Citizen buyers were often also interested in this second type of facility, in an attempt to lower the cost of stocking up on raw materials. They would use it to produce a semi-finished product to send to the city, or they would finish the weapons to then be sent onto the Italian and European markets. Merchants and craftspeople therefore proceeded to purchase wool parts from furnaces and other real estate, while inside the refineries concentrated lower down the valley, the iron masters worked on purifying the ore and on making bars or sheets of iron. City merchants could hire forges in part or in full, along with the utensils required for the work. The iron workers in the forge instead worked for the merchant, who had to pay rent to the owner, but they also had to option to work for themselves. Knives, swords, shields, and especially armour came out of the forges and workshops of Brescia during the early modern period. However, it's important to remember that so did many materials for construction and farm work, products that were less vulnerable to economic decline than the weapon industry. Venice, in turn, imposed regulations on the trade flow of arms from Brescia right from the beginning in 1426. This was particularly through a structural system of fiscal controls. The aim was to exert a sort of monopoly over products coming from Brescia and its valleys. What happened in reality was that much of the armor and weapons from Brescia ended up on the black market, evading the Venetian state's restriction and any regulation. The technical abilities of the Brescian masters were renowned beyond the borders of Brescia and the Republic of Venice, to the extent that they were in demand in several urban settings in Italy and throughout Europe. At the same time, merchants and buyers worked at home and abroad, and added value of Brescia's arms and armament production lay not just in the raw materials, but also in the skills of the city's masters. In the workshops inside the city walls, they hand-finished, including decorating them, semi-finished weapons, or even those that had already been fully manufactured in the valleys. The political system mounted by Venice was holding up in the second half of the 15th century, but certain aspects of citizens' lives began to fall into crisis. One of the main issues, as far as Brescia was concerned, remained the delegation of control over the municipal institution to a restricted group of citizens and families. The great knights belonged to this group, certainly. In addition to maintaining wide-reaching powers in the countryside, as well in this really famous castle, Padronella of the Martinengo family, close to the border at the Oglio River, the families took possession of the civic institution. Experience developed on the battlefields and in diplomacy enabled Brescian knights to establish a long-lasting presence in the general council of the town, even after the end of the aggression between Milan and Venice, concluded with the Peace of Lodi in 1454. Although the milites, the knights, interference in local public life had begun to cause impatience among the ruling class, the knights itself never truly left the political scene. This was partly due to the appearance of Emperor Frederick III, who in Venice admitted many Brescian nobles to the Order of the Golden Spur, and of Christian I of Denmark. From the Commune's resolutions, it is possible to see that towards the end of the 15th century, knights had a firm seat on the General Council, occupying important roles, even from a theoretical point of view. A knight could, in fact, have completed university studies in law and have experience in warfare. In any case, the presence of knights on the Great Council of Brescia in the late 15th and early 16th century was restricted to a small group of noble families, Avogadro, Martinengo, Emigli, Gambara, whose origins certainly could not be described as mercantile, but rather as feudal. The condottieri, the knights, were able to participate in civic government precisely on account of their long and ancient aristocratic history and heritage in time of peace, but particularly in times of war. On the other hand, this was also possible in Venetian mainland because military culture was a significant part of civic culture. It was indeed a war, or rather the Italian wars, that brought a new concept of nobility, based primarily on the practice of arms bearing to the various regional states. The aristocratic heavy cavalry of the French army was its vector following Charles VIII down to Italy in 1494. Following France's entry into Brescia in 59, a sort of infatuation with foreigners exploded in the city, driven by the grandiose entrée royale of King Louis XII, despite many doubts continuing over the effective common feeling of the Brescian nobility and the French aristocracy. It instead seems more likely that this influx was largely limited to uses and customs. However, it was condemned by preachers, chroniclers, and local humanists. If there was indeed a love for French, this had to be almost exclusively among the aristocratic Gambara clan, Gambara family, a Ghibelline family. This family had traditionally been against Venice, and its members were excluded from the Great Council of Brescia throughout the 15th century. The Gambara's position was surely a deliberate choice, driven particularly by political opportunism rather than any real ideological semblance with the French military aristocracy. Meanwhile, in Venetian Lombardy, citizens' factions remained strong and determined. They were true spaces for alternative politics to the civil and religious institutions. In this sense, the Gambaras made themselves the head, the chief of the Ghibelline faction, creating firm political connection outside of the Republic of Venice, especially in the courts of the northern Italy. When Brescia was eventually returned to Republic of Venice, sorry, the General Council was reestablished without the Gambara family. Given this political foundation of the cultural milieu, a recent finding in the archives seems to shed new and significant light on the military education and combat training of the faction inside the Brescian aristocracy at the time of Italian wars. A school notebook is stored in the Gambara archive of Verola Nuova, now at the State Archive of Brescia. It has no written date, but is from the first quarter of the 16th century. In it, besides some notes on rhetoric, grammar, and philosophy, there is a real fencing treatise, accompanied by some notes on dance and music. The part relating to fencing and the performance arts is written in Italian and not in Latin, unlike the other notes of grammar, rhetoric, and philosophy. These linguistic and paleographical aspects make it rather possible that it came from Eastern Lombardy, and the location at which it was stored suggests that the notebook was written right in the Gambara house. If the date and location of writing were confirmed by further studies, which are being carried out in the MAM of Botticino, guided by Roberto Gotti, Moreno, Laura, and other people, this would make it one of Italy's oldest treatises on fencing and would prove that there were masters, treatises, and advanced knowledges from the field of Western martial arts in circulation in Brescia in the early 16th century. Although refined and codified during the late Middle Ages, Italian fencing experienced its most prosperous age during the Renaissance. Too often do the historiographers reduce this practice of the martial arts to recreational or performance activity, thus fueling a seriously bad view. Beyond its use on the battlefield, fencing is a complex system of techniques and theory that was useful in the daily life of man in the early modern era in Europe. Neither does this prove how widespread it was in Italian society from 15th and 17th century, accompanied by the proliferation of fencing treatises. We had just heard of Achille Marozzo, of Pietro Monte, Antonio Manciolino, and other important fencing treatises. The presence of masters and circulation of fencing texts in Brescia during the 16th century, of which the anonymous Gambara could be further proof, in addition to those noted in the 70s of the 16th century, is not at all surprising. The level of violence reached in Brescia and the Venetian mainland during the 16th century was unbelievable. The chronicles and documents from archives in the first half of the century tell us of a climate of perennial social tension, in which duels, brawls, and ambushes and killings were wanted to present themselves as the art of the aristocracy values. The image by which the nobles wanted to present themselves at this time mirrored the state of constant warfare and the sense of honor of each house. In portraits, like this one conserved in the National Gallery of London, or on the gates of the magnificent palaces of Brescia in the 16th century, even today we can see the symbol of this new culture of violence. Armor and weapons feature most prominently, but there are also drums and shields. Not giving way in a public square or a wrong look in church could be enough to spark a brawl or to publish a challenge to a duel, a type of text that was really common in Brescia between the Middle Ages and the early modern period. The attitude of the municipal authorities or of the representatives of Venice sovereignty towards this form of violence was always very ambiguous. The most common judicial and political responses were banishment sentencing, with which the Venetian magistrates sought to break ties within the aristocratic clans by exiling and isolating those subjects considered most dangerous to the society. The consequence in the long term was the birth of social banditry, which led to the unruly presence of dangerous outcasts, nobles for the most part, in the countryside and at the borders of the state. This phenomenon was a key feature in the history of Lombardy throughout modernity until the beginning of the 19th century. At the same time, the production and local markets for weapons responded to the needs of a society thus governed by violent interaction. I'm going to conclusion. In the 16th century, other communities, other towns, in addition to Brescia themselves, contributed to the manufacture of weapons and arms in general. The case of Caino, for example, in the Garza Valley, studied by Roberto Gotti, is a really famous example. During the 16th century, the same intense activity is registered in Valtrompia and Salò Riviera, close to the Garda Lake, and other Brescian valleys, such as Valsabbia and Valcamonica. Despite this, at the turn of the 17th century, the great tradition of Brescian weapon industry faced a serious setback. Firearms, and especially small ones, were gradually pushing out cold weapons, including for personal use. This gave birth to a new and extraordinary technical and artisanal tradition that lasts to today, particularly on an industrial level. The sword culture of the Middle Ages, with its wealth of knowledge and skills, went into an unstoppable decline. Passing through Brescia in 1608, the most famous English traveler of the early modern period, Thomas Coryat, admired the city's splendid monuments and also noted the presence of, I cite this past, excellent artisans making knives, shields, and swords. When he reached the countryside between Brescia and Bergamo, however, he realized the peculiar deportment of the men on horseback. Well armed with muskets and pistols, loaded and ready to shoot. The saga of the medieval knights, by necessity accompanied by the sword, had reached its end. A new era of violence had begun, clouded in gunpowder. Thank you so much for listening.